We're here today with Tom Hill, Senior Advisor for Practice Improvement and Consulting with the National Council for Behavioral Health. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us today to talk about stigma around MOUD. Can you first get us started by telling us just a little bit about your role at the National Council?
Sure, Christina. Thank you so much for having me today. I also just saw where I'd really like to start is to tell people that I am a person in long-term recovery from addiction. And for me, that means that I haven't used alcohol or other drugs in over 28 years and have, really had an amazing life as a result of my recovery. So it enables me to be here sitting in front of you right now. My role at the National Council is I switched this year from Vice President of Practice Improvement to Senior Advisor position, really because I wanted to do less administrative work and do more subject matter work, really around what are the necessary things we need to retool our entire field to be more responsive to people that are experiencing recovery, experiencing overdose, in need of recovery, in need of harm reduction, those kinds of things. Those are a lot of our initiatives at the National Council are geared in that direction of practice improvement.
Thank you for sharing, and congratulations on your long-term recovery.
Thank you.
That's awesome. So proud of you for that. So let's jump into it. Stigma around MOUD. What do you perceive as the kind of primary ways that it manifests, and then how do you suggest that folks might address it and overcome it?
So, I want to start with introducing a publication to people if they don't know about it. It's the Surgeon General's report that came out in 2016, and it's called Facing Addiction in America, Alcohol, Drugs, and Health. And it largely came about because of the addiction epidemic and the overdose epidemic that we've been experiencing for some time. And it's a really amazing publication, and it defines addiction as well-supported evidence shows that addiction to alcohol or drugs is a chronic brain disease that has potential for reoccurrence and recovery. And I think that's a really nice, simple definition, but it really emphasizes the fact that it is a chronic condition. Like many other chronic conditions, there's no cure for it, but it can be managed. So like somebody with diabetes, like somebody with hypertension, through a series of behavior changes and medications and various things, counseling, you can actually change and manage that chronic condition. I think it's really important to look at it that way, especially since most of our systems were designed to address addiction as an acute condition. When treatment ended, people went into the community and didn't have the supports they needed necessarily, and that's where the recurrence to use would happen, and recovery might be jeopardized. So just is an important thing to look at as a framework and a perspective. But that publication also moves the idea from addiction as a moral failing to a brain disorder, which is a big, big shift, from an acute condition to a chronic condition, as we discussed, and from criminal justice approaches to public health strategies. So despite all this scientific evidence, there's still a lot of misconceptions and predominant attitudes and assumptions that reinforce stigma, and we know that. And it's a really hard lift in order to change those public attitudes. So let's start with the big one. I want you to think of addiction not as a choice. And that's contrary to what a lot of people think. So even when you consider the first time someone uses alcohol or other drugs, there's so many factors to consider. A major factor is trauma. And so we know that there's trauma exists in the lives of a lot of people. And I want to draw your attention to a really amazing study that was done in the 1990s. It was a collaboration between the Center for Disease Control, CDC, government agency, and Kaiser Institute. And it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs. And it goes through 10 different domains that include things like emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, divorce in the home, violence to the mother, family member incarcerated, 10 different things. And then, the more of those things you check yes to, the higher a predilection you have toward health conditions that include mental health issues, anxiety, depression, sometimes suicide, and then heavy substance use and addiction. And so I will tell you that when I did the survey, I got 7 out of 10. And I thought, if I had known about this study and this framework when I was in early recovery, it really would have helped me, because I had so many questions floating around. And if I'd had this framework to put things together, it would have made a lot more sense about what were some of the root causes. So, I want to emphasize this right now. For many people like myself, they don't use substances to feel good. They use them to not feel bad. And that's a really big difference. Again, they don't use drugs to escape reality. They use drugs to alleviate pain. And so whether that's physical pain or that's emotional or psychic pain, that's definitely connected to trauma, that's present in a lot of people's lives. And so when you talk about, people using out of choice or becoming addicted out of choice, it sort of belies that myth and breaks that down and said that, we don't know what that person's life was like up to the time that they either started using or became addicted. And that's a really critical piece of knowledge that we need to sort of develop when we start thinking about why people do these things. So let's talk about the stigma of medication. So, because it's definitely correlated to the stigma of addiction. So there's 3 types of FDA-approved medication. There's methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. And they all have different properties and restrictions and regulations, and they work better for some people than others. And there's a lot of different decisions to make about that. But the bottom line is that medication for opioid use disorder is an evidence-based practice, and it saves lives. So that's the baseline. Like, it's a good thing, right? So the wrinkle there is that methadone and buprenorphine are opioid-based. And because of that, there's been a lot of misinformation and myths about that. We even have something we call drug replacement therapy, which, when you think about it, is not only wrong, but it's very stigmatizing. We say that it's not abstinence-based. And if you are on any of those medications, and you're not using opioids, but you may not be using any other substance, then you're practicing abstinence, because you're not using drug replacement, you're using medicine. And I think we have to really look at that terminology about how that perpetuates myth and stigma. And that the bottom line is people have been accused of not being in recovery because they're on medication. And this is in the treatment community, this is in corrections, this is in the recovery community, this is in the faith-based community. It's prevalent in our culture. So that's been a huge shift and a huge lift in terms of getting medication as therapy, sort of used commonly in ways that overcome the stigma and actually help people get better and keep people alive and enhance their lives. So, a lot of this stigma has resulted in misguided policies. There's a policy that medication's okay, but you have to taper off as quickly as possible. And that's not, the evidence doesn't say that. The evidence says that you need to be on it as long as you need to be on. We don't tell people who have diabetes to taper off their Lipitor, right? So it's medication and it's doctor prescribed, and it needs to be used accordingly. And no one else should be telling anybody else about tapering off or expectations thereof. The other thing is that, in a lot of correctional facilities, medication has been regarded as a privilege that can be revoked and taken away if somebody misbehaves, right? Would we do that with any other medication? Absolutely not. So and medication is not a privilege, it's a medical necessity. And there's ethical issues around that, and there's legal issues around that.
Right.
And that, we have to be really, really important, really careful about how we regard that. We're dealing with human beings who have a chronic condition, right? The other thing is promoting one medication over another. That first of all three choices are not always available, but ideally they should be made available, and access to those three choices. And people need to be able to make informed choices about what medication suits them the best, under what considerations and circumstances. So those kinds of things, are really steeped in stigma, and we need to look at all those kind of policies and say, is this really best practice according to science-based evidence or not, and make those decisions accordingly. So, for folks that work in corrections, there's a huge culture shift that has to happen, and it's incumbent upon you to instigate that culture shift in your work environment. Because unless you do it, those attitudes are going to undermine any of the kind of policies that you're trying to create, and the change you're trying to make. So, you have to work with your staff. You have to do training. You have to do lots of things. And here's a few things that'll help, move the work culture along, like to do a language audit and expectations. So that, we know a lot of language is very stigmatizing, things like abuse. We already talked about trauma, and we talked about abuse there. So calling somebody a substance abuser is a double whammy if they've had a history of trauma, and not really helpful, right? But there's other things like dirty and clean urine. It's like, I'm trying to think of somebody who's non-compliant. It's not really strength-based, person-centered language. We talk about person-centered language in terms of helping people. We don't call somebody an addict. We call them a person with addiction, or a person experiencing addiction. We don't use the word offender. But in prison culture, that's a word that maybe you should think about. Maybe there's other ways of saying that. A person who is incarcerated is a simple substitute for that. But to call someone an offender has a very heavy label to it, and we need to always look at that in terms of how we're referring to people. I think we talked about earlier about understanding the nature of addiction as a chronic condition that may need medication, that probably needs clinical treatment or some kind of counseling, and can use, peer recovery supports. It's what I call the three-legged stool: medication, clinical help, and recovery supports. And those things seem to be a winning combination of helping people get better. That we start training our staff in trauma-informed, recovery-oriented, person-centered care. And, by nature, a lot of corrections environments, they're trauma-inducing. They're not trauma-informed. And changing that culture is a heavy lift. It's a punitive culture, and we're trying to invoke strength-based practices within a punitive culture. And how do you reckon that? And it will be incremental change over time. It's possible, and it's something that will benefit everybody in terms of even the people who work in that culture. Understanding the prominence of mental health issues, especially depression, anxiety, and how they play into a person's substance use and addiction, again, with trauma behind all of that. But those are everyday realities for people. And then, the bottom line is like affirming that, like any other medical condition, people who are experiencing it deserve empathy, compassion, and respect. And so, these are not these people that may have made big mistakes that have put them into the situation they're in right now, but they're changing their lives. And we need to come together and help them figure out practices and procedures that will instigate that change, nurture that change, and help them along the way. So these are just a few of the things that need to happen. And I'm calling upon all of you, because you're in this conference right now, to carry the torch forward and say, in order to be really medically responsible and humanly responsible to people, we need to meet them where they're at. We need to not leave them there, and help them move along no matter what kinds of environment they're in or situation, and then prepare them for what it looks like to leave. So I hope some of these things were helpful, very high level, but sort of a call to action in terms of if you want to make medications for opioid use disorders in correctional facilities and institutions work, you sort of have to address all of this in a really meaningful way to put your, as we say in recovery, to to walk the talk, basically, right? Like you had to do the groundwork in order to make all this stuff a reality. And I know a lot of it's a heavy lift, but this is a really important part of it. So I thank you for coming. I thank you for knowing that this is an important thing to do. And thank you for addressing all these stigmatizing things that will not lift overnight, but they will lift eventually. We've seen an incredible shift in movement in the field, and I hope it happens in the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences in the work that you're doing. We appreciate all the work that you're doing in this space. And with that call to action, I am going to sign off.
Thank you.